Good evening. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. I'm also excited to share that we will be bringing back our in-person events, beginning with an exclusive members-only tour of a new exhibit at the Skirball Center in July. We will be planning to fully reopen in-person events to the public after Labor Day. So please check out our website. We're posting new programs every week. For those of you who would like to ask questions of our speaker, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of the screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 30 or 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to introduce a conversation with Israeli Consul General Dr. Hillel Newman, moderated by Dan Schnur, who is a politics professor at USC, UC Berkeley, and Pepperdine University. Dan, it's time to bring you on to introduce Dr. Newman. What a timely and perfect program for this evening.
Oh no, it's very exciting, and the timing couldn't be better, even if it is a little bit later than you and I normally meet up for these programs, Kim. So
I'm turning it over to you both. Take care.
Okay. Consul General Newman, we are so happy to have you with us today. We know you've participated in our LA World Affairs Council town hall programs in the past, but particularly given the events in the news of the last few weeks, having you with us today, I think is an extremely important opportunity for all of our members. And we're grateful that you'd be willing to take time out of your very busy schedule to join us.
Thank you, Professor Schnur. It is my honor and pleasure to appear here on the platform with you and under the auspices of the World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'd like to thank Kim, the President and CEO, for inviting me, and the entire team, Jessica and Claire and everyone. It is my pleasure, and I'm at your service anytime.
Well, we would normally keep the pleasantries going for several more minutes, but we've got a lot of news and a lot of important events to get through. So I'm going to dig right in, and then we'll spend the first portion of the program, you and I talking. But as Kim mentioned, then at that point, toward the bottom of the hour, we'll get to what I think you'll find a much more interesting part of the program when Jessica joins us, and we replace my questions with much smarter ones from our members in our audience. The first question is almost an unfair one, because I feel, look, whenever I get into a discussion with someone about the root causes of the conflicts between Israel and the Palestinians, it very quickly spirals out of control as you go back further and further in history. I don't know if you saw it, but in the foreword last week, their editor, our Jody Rudoran, said that whenever she is asked about root causes, she wants to start out by saying, Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, and then to go forward from there. So I'm not going to ask you for quite that comprehensive a history, but I'm wondering if as we begin the conversation, you can talk a little bit about how, from your perspective and from Israel's perspective, what triggered this latest conflict?
Sure. Thank you, Dan. If I would actually shorten the answer very briefly, and I would say that the root cause for the conflict is the acceptance of Israel. And I can give several proofs of that. Right? The conflict is not about territory, it's not about water, it's not about settlements. It's about the very existence of the state of Israel in the Middle East. And Bernard Lewis once said, if you have a dispute about territory or something, borders, you can negotiate, you can compromise. But when a dispute is about the very existence of an entity, then how do you compromise? Your half existence, quarter existence. Our battle with the Hamas, for instance, is about the existence of Israel in any border. They don't accept Israel's existence in any border. So we must be clear about that. It's I can give so many proofs. I'll just suffice with two and say, when they chant from the river to the sea, we want Palestine free, that means the erasing of the state of Israel in any border. We should understand what it means, because from the river to the sea means from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. That's not the West Bank. It's not Gaza Strip. It's not disputed territories. Or if you just look at when the PLO was established, which is the father organization of the Palestinian Authority, it was established even before Israel took over what is called the disputed territories. So I could go on and on. Now, what triggered the events at this time was very clear. It was internal rivalry between the Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and their rivalry on the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. The fact that the Palestinian Authority under Abu Mazen canceled the elections after 16 years that they haven't had elections. There were supposed to be elections in June, and Abu Mazen saw that he was going to the elections at a great loss. In fact, the Hamas had the upper hand, so he canceled them. And that gave tremendous frustration to the Hamas. Second aspect that gave them frustration was the fact that Israel was moving forward in its normalization of relations with the Arab world, which was a breaking of the taboo that the Hamas and the Palestinian Authority always had on any development of relations in the Middle East. They always felt that they had blind support, and now all of a sudden the Arab world was not giving their blind support. And the third aspect was the further integration of Israeli Arabs in Israeli society, which was a bone in the throat of the Hamas. They're, of course, in favor of isolating Israel in order to erase Israel. And any integration of the Israeli Arabs in society is a bone in their throat. So it was a perfect storm which came about because the Hamas decided to take the leadership and rally the people behind the flag. How do you rally the people behind the flag? You say, Israel is doing this, Israel is doing that. We must now rise in order to save the Temple Mount or save whatever it is. And that way you rally with false propaganda and you incite and you instigate violence. They planned the violence in advance. They hoarded rocks to pelt on the Temple Mount and on the Western Wall. They planned the attacks of the rockets. They even sent out terrorists to do terrorist attacks in Israel. That was the instigation. It had nothing to do with anything that Israel did or didn't do.
So I'm going to pick up on the paraphrase you offered a minute ago for the Palestinian argument. Israel is doing this, Israel is doing that. Let's talk for a minute about the this and the that. I will admit, I don't like it when commentators refer to the low level of violence that exists in this area, because that implies, intentionally or not, that there's a tolerable level of violence, which is unacceptable. But we should agree that the spike in violence that's occurred over the last few weeks, to the greatest level over the last 7 years, is by definition less ordinary. And the Palestinian leaders, both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, point to two things in particular, and that is the dispute over the residency of Palestinians living in certain houses in East Jerusalem, and number two, the unrest that's occurred on the Temple Mount recently. So, can you address this and that in more detail?
Of course. You know, in a front today, you actually have two fronts. With any battle or any challenge that you have two fronts. One is the physical front, where you're meeting the physical threat, but at the same time, you have a second front, which is the hearts and minds of the people, or the PR, or public relations, whatever you want to call it, public diplomacy, whatever it's called. Israel, as a sovereign state and a democratic state, does not release any false information, does not release false perceptions, or try to lie or deceive in any way. We're very careful about that. We build ourselves on credibility. Whereas the Hamas, and even the Palestinian Authority, unfortunately, very often use PR as an incite, to incite the masses. And therefore they release things which are totally false. And we have to then afterwards battle not only the rockets which are falling on our heads, but also the false perceptions and the false statements. It's very easy to release a false slogan, a false statement, and then we have to go and prove that it's incorrect. So these two issues, for instance, were totally false. It was released by the Hamas that Israel is evicting Palestinians from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. Totally false. What actually happened was that they manipulated a court case where there was a legal private dispute between Jewish owners of homes in Sheikh Jarrah and Arab squatters who were in the home. And they went to court. It took a long time. It was a process over years. And the court ruled in the end that legally the homes belonged to the Jews, and the illegal squatters who were not paying rent must leave the home. In any normal circumstance, this would be seen as a legal dispute decided by the courts. In normal circumstances, the courts in Israel very often rule in favor of the Palestinians. And then everyone upholds the robust judicial system in Israel. Once the court rules that actually it was proven to them beyond doubt that these homes belong to Jews, then all of a sudden it's an eviction, it's no judicial system, a lack of trust and confidence. So let's put the facts on the table. There was no eviction by the state of Israel of Palestinians from their homes. It wasn't their homes. The court gave a ruling. In any country, law and order, you respect what the court decides, and therefore the Arab residents had to leave the houses. It was manipulated by the Hamas, out of context and totally false. The second thing about the status quo of the Temple Mount and the riots on the Temple Mount, every time the Hamas want to incite and rally people to violence, they immediately come out with a statement: Israel is attacking the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israel is changing the status quo on the Temple Mount. Every time it's untrue. Israel has no intention of changing anything, any status quo on the Temple Mount. We preserve it sacredly. Even during the Ramadan, we allowed an unprecedented amount of Muslims to go up to ascend the Temple Mount. More than 70,000 ascended the Temple Mount, unprecedented numbers. The total freedom of worship. The problem was that they abused that sanctity of the site and the freedom of worship. They hoarded rocks in advance and then pelted them on the Muslim worshippers and on the Jewish worshippers at the Western Wall. That was the sequel of events that caused the forces of Israel to go in. Usually, when we took over that territory in the 60s, we could have done whatever we wanted. We preserved the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We left everything as it was, and we even gave authority to the Waqf, which is a Muslim authority, to preserve the sanctity of the Temple Mount. And in this case also, the Waqf were there. They were supposed to maintain control. Once it got out of control because they were pelting rocks, Israel went in order to bring down tensions and try and prevent escalation. That's the sequel of events. People are fed narratives which we cannot control.
Okay. So now, on one hand, we've talked about the Palestinian Authority and Hamas's assertions here. But to be fair, earlier today, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken made a similar point. And in fact, he talked about these two occurrences as having the potential to spark renewed, quote, tension, conflict, and war. And it was reported that in an interview with the Axios website, that he warned Israeli leaders that these two, both the Temple Mount and the questions of residency in East Jerusalem are matters on which the Israeli government should avoid in order to prevent a further outbreak. Now, to be fair, I will say to those of our audience who did not read about Mr. Blinken's comments, the Secretary of State also said that he raised with Palestinian leaders questions of their incitement to violence, or in his words, not mine, letting violence go forward with impunity. And he raised what he called the very problematic payments made to the families of Palestinians convicted of terrorism. But it sounds like the U.S. Secretary of State is saying that both the Temple Mount and the East Jerusalem residency questions are something that Israel needs to back off of.
Well, there are many reports about what somebody has said and not said. I'm waiting for the exact text because we can't rely on reports to relate to something that Secretary Blinken said or did not say. Many times things are reported mistakenly. All I can say is that, Secretary Blinken just had a visit in Israel. He met with the leadership of Israel. Throughout the violence, there were intimate conversations between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden and Secretary Blinken at all levels, at security levels, at foreign ministry level, very high level talks. So I'm sure that he knows the facts. If he took it as, adopted a narrative that because of eviction of Palestinians from their homes, or because of something that Israel did on the Temple Mount, that is the trigger of the events, then he's mistaken. I'm very doubtful that he actually said that. That I can just repeat that and make it clear that Israel as a state has no intention of evicting anybody from their apartments. In this case, it was a court ruling. It wasn't even done by the state of Israel, and Israel intervened in order to give a stay on the implementation, so that in order to calm things down, Israel requested the courts not to implement their ruling for 30 days. And that, in other words, as a state, we requested not to evict the Palestinians from their illegal squatting for at least 30 days, to give a stay and to give some calm. So Israel's intervention in this was only in order to allow the Palestinians to continue to live there against the court ruling. Israel as a state was not involved in this debate. And about the Temple Mount, again, the sequence of events is very clear. I know for a fact that in the leading up to the final days of the Ramadan, which we know is a tense period of time, Israel took extra special precaution in order to try and prevent friction between the Muslim worshippers and the Jewish worshippers, and to allow maximum numbers and capacity of the Temple Mount for Muslim worshippers. So every precaution was taken. The problem was that things went out of control when the Hamas just started launching rockets and terrorist attacks, and it went out of control.
So you mentioned, and I'm sure we'll find out in the days ahead if that's what the secretary said or not. But at least for now, you referred briefly to his visit to Israel, but also to the West Bank. And it seemed, at least from news reports, that his primary focus was on aid to Gaza, at least as opposed right now to a broader path toward peace in the region. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to offer your overall assessment of Secretary Blinken's visit.
Sure. First of all, we welcome Secretary Blinken to Israel anytime. This is part of the fundamental, the relationship between Israel and the United States is as strong as ever, because it's based on fundamental values. It's not just interests between countries. In many ways, I think that the leadership of the United States has also proven its friendship with Israel throughout this round of violence, but also understands that when a democracy is attacked by rockets, by a terrorist organization, then you must stand with the state of Israel, with any democracy that is attacked against a terrorist organization. And that's what they did. They also blocked resolutions in the UN, which we're so used to. Anytime there's any kind of incident, then immediately there's a resolution against Israel. Doesn't matter what the facts are, doesn't matter whether it's a terrorist organization, immediate resolutions against Israel, and President Biden blocked them. During this visit, I can tell you that there were many issues on the table. Among them was also how to rehabilitate the Gaza Strip in a way that does not empower Hamas. Both Israel and the United States have no interest in empowering the Hamas. Israel relinquished the entire Gaza Strip over to the Palestinian Authority in 2005. There's no occupation, no Israeli presence in the Gaza Strip since 2005. The Hamas took over by force, and since then they control what's going on in the Gaza Strip. And instead of using the aid for building lives for the Palestinian and economic entity viability, they have actually dug underground tunnels and smuggled in weapons and launched rockets against Israel. So that's the result of what we call territory for peace. Israel gave territory and received no peace. So this whole paradigm has to be investigated again. And Secretary Blinken came in order to coordinate with Israel how we rehabilitate the Gaza Strip in a way that will empower the moderate forces in the Palestinian Authority and not empower the Hamas. We also had, of course, Iran on the table and other issues.
So now President Biden has made it very clear that the rebuilding of Gaza will go through the Palestinian Authority and not through Hamas. But I know while the Palestinian Authority, while not designated as a terrorist organization by the US the way that Hamas is, I know that the state of Israel has its problems with the Palestinian Authority as well. So I guess a two-part question here. One is Israel's comfort level with the Palestinian Authority acting as the conveyor of that aid to Gaza, and more broadly, how you'd assess future policy regarding Hamas and the Palestinian Authority.
Yes, the idea of rehabilitating and assisting the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian Authority via the Palestinian Authority is in total agreement by Israel. In fact, Israel has been following a policy for the past decade or so, since Abu Mazen has refused to negotiate with Israel, and that began quite a few years ago. And this is an absurd situation that Israel is perceived as the stronger one with the territory, and the Palestinian Authority is the weaker one, but Israel has been requesting Abu Mazen to come to the table for the past decade, and it's Abu Mazen that refuses. And deals have been put on the table, and Abu Mazen is the one that has refused it without any counteroffer. So we can see where we are, but still, we give our trust in the Palestinian Authority as the more moderate entity, and we would like to work with the Palestinian Authority. And you know, if you visit Ramallah, you will see a prosperous, thriving city. People don't know this, but we have followed a policy of trying to facilitate and encourage economic prosperity in the Palestinian Authority, so that the people of the Palestinians will have two choices. One is the Hamas, which leads them to death and devastation, and we see the results of their actions. And the other one is working with Israel, coexisting with Israel via the Palestinian Authority. We can't say that the Palestinian Authority is wonderful. They make the wrong decisions at every turn. Abu Mazen could have had a state long time ago if he would have accepted the offers that were put on the table. He joins very often in the incitement, which he did when the Hamas started inciting. He didn't want to feel left behind and lose the street, so he also joined with the incitement. That's very unfortunate, because to be a leader, you must have the backbone and lead and not be led.
Okay, so just to follow up on that briefly, Abbas has said some extremely harsh things, of course, about Israel, and the Israeli government has let it known of its unhappiness with him and the Palestinian Authority at no shortage of times. But just to be clear, despite the what seems to be fairly strong hostilities between the two, you do see Palestinian Authority as an acceptable alternative for providing aid to Gaza.
Yes, all the time that they continue on the path of some kind of acceptance of Israel. You know, it's not even clear that they've accepted the existence of the state of Israel. It's not clear at all. The Hamas say it categorically that they reject the existence of the state of Israel. It's in their charter. They want to kill all Jews, and they want to annihilate the state of Israel. It's written in their charter for anyone to read. So there's no obscure action aspects about that. But the Palestinian Authority has been in obscurity. On the one hand, they accepted the Oslo Accords, but immediately after Arafat signed the Oslo Accords, he started speaking in Arabic in a way that he doesn't accept Israel's existence, and he joined the resistance, the violent resistance to Israel. So then Abu Mazen came into the picture. We hope that with Abu Mazen, things will be different. There won't be a double language, and he will go straight to the agreements with Israel. Abu Mazen does play a game. I think he's weak. He's fearing the more radical forces in the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. He's afraid perhaps even of being assassinated if he goes forward too far with Israel. He has them on his neck, these radical forces, especially the Hamas. The Hamas, if we went for elections, who knows who would win in the Palestinian Authority. So he takes all of this into consideration, and therefore he doesn't make a decision of moving forward in peace with Israel. And sometimes he joins the incitement. So what do you do? Is that a partner? It's a big dilemma for Israel.
Well, you mentioned earlier the conversations throughout the conflict that President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu have been having. Most news accounts suggest that there were two primary messages that Biden was delivering to Netanyahu. One was the U.S. support for the right of Israel to defend itself, but the second was also a caution that world opinion, and in particular U.S. domestic political opinion, was shifting in a way that was not favorable toward the Israeli cause. So to take a step back, how would you assess Israel's successes and failures over the course of the last few weeks. Was military gain a worthwhile trade-off for the potential challenges in terms of worldwide and U.S. public perception?
Yeah, as I said, in every battle you have two fronts, and you have the physical front, and you also have the PR on the imagery front. And unfortunately, many people, innocent and naive people, are swept up in false perceptions, false statements which are released, and then we have to go and try and battle and prove that it's incorrect, just like the evictions and the Temple Mount and other aspects which are totally false. So we have to battle this at the same time. Well, you know, once it was said that we prefer to be alive, perhaps with a bad image, than to be dead with a good image. It was said by a greater people than me. We were attacked. We were attacked by more than 4,000 rockets launched against more than 5 million civilians in Israel. That means that each civilian had approximately 15 seconds to run to a bomb shelter, because if the rocket falls on their home and they're not in a bomb shelter, they can be killed instantly. Can anyone imagine living in such a situation? It's an unacceptable situation. Any government would do everything in order to bring an immediate cessation of the launching of such rockets. That is the obligation. It's not only the right, it's the obligation of every nation to do what is necessary in order to bring about a cessation of an attack of rockets against its civilians. And there are some people who try to deny that right from Israel. Which I can just imagine if the United States was attacked by rockets or missiles from anywhere, I can hardly believe that anyone would say that the United States should not respond and not act in self-defense. But for some reason, in the context of Israel, even the most obvious becomes questionable. So at the price of a bad image, we have to do what we have to do to bring safety and security. And I can just tell you that throughout the battle, Israel implemented the utmost caution in order not to attack or not to hit civilians, innocent civilians, even though the Hamas positioned themselves within populated civilian areas and targeted civilian populated areas, which is a double war crime. But Israel did its most not to do it. Now, what are our achievements? I would say that the best or the greatest achievements of this are that we have uprooted the entire underground tunnel system in the Hamas, in the Gaza Strip, which was built by the Hamas. We have demolished the rocket factories, which were the production line of the rockets, and we have eliminated many of the terrorists. Our failures, I would say, are, yes, an image. You can never win in such a situation. When you're attacked by a terrorist organization, you can't really win, whatever the pictures are and the images are. And another failure is that, you know, there's a real dilemma here. What do we do in order to uproot the Hamas? The only way to really uproot them is to go in a ground operation in Gaza. But we don't want to do that. We don't want to take control over Gaza. We don't want the responsibility of the Palestinians who live in Gaza. We don't want to occupy Gaza. So that's a dilemma. And sometimes, you know, there's pressure in Israel to say, look, we have to erase Hamas from Gaza. So that's an ongoing dilemma.
So when we see public opinion in Israel, when we see public opinion polls there suggesting that the ceasefire should not have come so quickly, in your opinion, that reflects the desire on a lot of the Israeli people to not just compromise Hamas, but to completely reoccupy Gaza?
Yes, I would say that a wide consensus in Israel. You know, Israel tolerates just about every view from far left to far right. And we're even in the middle of a political debacle of not getting to a coalition government. But the opposition party to Netanyahu and Netanyahu sat together. Netanyahu's Minister of Defense, Gantz, is leading one of the parties which is trying to topple Netanyahu. But they sat together and they worked together shoulder to shoulder on this issue, because there's a wide consensus in Israel about the fact that we are under attack by a terrorist organization. We must do what is necessary in order to protect the civilians. There's no real dispute about that. And so also there is a bit of a dilemma or dispute or differences of opinion about the strategy. What is the strategy? So some say we must continue this idea of from far mowing the lawn, as one would say, as some political scientists have said. Mowing the lawn, occasionally, when you have a terrorist organization on your border, you have to mow the lawn, you have to cut the terrorists. Others say, no, we should do a ground operation, take over Gaza. I'll conclude this issue with one statement. You know, when Prime Minister Sharon evacuated the Gaza Strip in 2005, he said to the people of Israel, if we evacuate the Gaza Strip, relinquish it over to the Palestinian Authority, we'll have every legitimacy to act in self-defense when necessary. Because he was warned that there will be rockets from Gaza. Now, unfortunately, Prime Minister Sharon doesn't live anymore, but we just see that doesn't matter what Israel does, they're never given legitimacy. We relinquish the entire Gaza Strip. We're attacked from there, and people don't want us to respond. That's an impossible situation.
Well, and as you mentioned a moment ago, trading survival in exchange for public perception, is a fairly existential trade and an understandable one to make. That said, the changing nature, I'll say diplomatically, of U.S. voter support for Israel in this country in recent years has been noticeable. We've seen a precipitous drop in U.S. support and sympathy for Israel and a growth for the support and sympathy for the Palestinians. Talk, if you can, a little bit about how that change in public perception and public opinion affects the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Well, I'll tell you, the polls show that, first of all, there's strong support for the relationship between Israel and the United States in both parties, the Democratic and the Republican Party. The mainstream support the relationship and understand the depth of the importance of the relationship and the fundamental values which we share. Even amongst the public, the majority support Israel. They understand the facts of the situation. Now, we are aware of the fact that there are parts of society, especially the young on campuses, where they're misled. Unfortunately, they are misled with slogans, and there are trends, popular trends. And I think that one of the trends is that, okay, if this is weak, this one is perceived as weak, and this one is perceived as strong, we immediately support the weak, the perceived weak. But, it doesn't mean the fact that someone is weaker than another, even it's a perceived weakness, and I'll explain also why it's only a perceived weakness. But perceived weakness doesn't mean that they're right. When Al-Qaeda attacked the United States and bombed the twin buildings, that doesn't mean Al-Qaeda is weaker than the United States in its force. It doesn't mean that Al-Qaeda now is right or justified. It doesn't mean that the United States should not act against Al-Qaeda in order to prevent such attacks. So that whole perception is false, but it's also perceived wrongly, because we might be stronger because we have a state. But, there's a lot of leverage that a terrorist organization has, and they do things that a state cannot do. A terrorist organization, as I said, attacks civilian populated areas, attacks from civilian populated areas, which are things which we do not do because we have values as a state. And we are a value-oriented country. So we are actually, in many times, we are the weaker side in a battle against terrorists. Or the fact, for instance, that we are calling upon Abu Mazen and the Palestinian leadership to come to the table. We have made offers of peace, and they reject them without any counter offers. So who is the strong and who's the weak? Many things are perceived wrongly. But we do follow the polls, and we are concerned that some people are misled by slogans or by popular trends.
So the question, as I understand it, is then, or the challenge, as I understand it, then is, how do you convince a segment of the American populace that Israel is David, not Goliath?
Well, we try to do it with the facts, and we try to do it with credibility and stating the facts. And we say to people, learn the facts of the situation before you make up your mind and come out with statements. Learn the facts of the situation, and check the slogans and the facts that are released in the media. That is my best advice to anyone. And don't just follow empty slogans. There's also a new trend of what's sectionalism, which brings about a comparison between three things which sometimes are have no comparison, just a superficial comparison. So you say oppression here, therefore it's the same thing. But then we should check, is there oppression here and is there oppression there? And who is more oppressed? The Jews, who are surrounded by, there are 22 Arab states in the Arab League. Only 2 recognized Israel up to a year ago. And in the past year, another 4 have joined. But the majority of the Arab League do not recognize Israel, do not have diplomatic relations with Israel. That's not Israel's fault. Israel extends its hand in friendship and peace to everyone, every Muslim state, every Arab state. So something, when you say who's David and who's Goliath, I think you should look at little Israel and the entire Middle East. Look at the neighbors of Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen. What's happening in the Middle East? What's happening in the world? And then you'll see that Israel is David and we're surrounded by a big Goliath.
Well, I'm going to need to open this up to our audience's questions in just a minute or two. But I have so many other things, Consul General, that I want to ask you about Iran, about the rise of anti-Semitism in this country, about the political landscape in Israel as to whether a 5th election might take place. But I guess with the time I have left, I'd like to build on the point that you just made about the normalization and improvement in relationships between Israel and at least a number of Arab states, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, possibly in the future Saudi Arabia. My question would be, how would the Arab nations involved in the Abraham Accords, how does their relationship with Israel impact the ability to achieve some level of peace between Israel and the Palestinians? Can they play a role as a broker? Is their role potentially helpful, or does it work the other way, where they then lean on Israel to be more willing to accede to Palestinian priorities?
Well, I'm glad to say that not only have we established peaceful relations, normalizing of relations with an additional 5 countries over the past year, but this relationship came to its first tests now, and it withstood the test. Part of the dreams of the Hamas were that they would reverse normalization of relations between Israel and some of the Arab states like UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, and I'm sure that they expected that some of them would, they cause violence, they instigate tremendous tension and violence, and then accuse Israel, and then hope that these countries will cut their ties with Israel. It's happened in the past with the wars which were initiated against Israel. This time it didn't happen. None of the states that have joined and normalized their relations with Israel, none of them cut their relations or reversed it. And you know why? Because they know that Israel is an ally and Israel is a peace-loving country, whereas the Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is behind the Hamas and the other radical organizations, are their enemy. They know that, just like they know that Iran is their enemy and Israel is their ally. They understand correctly the whole regional outlay and the infrastructure and the structure of what's going on in the Middle East. Unfortunately, many people don't understand. They don't understand that there's a wide coalition of friendship and support between, it's not only Israel, it's the Persian Gulf states, other states. They all understand what's at risk and what's going on in the Middle East. And many naive people don't understand. So if they can be a broker, I'm not sure they can be a broker, because the Palestinians don't accept any broker. They've refused American brokering of peace over the past decade, and I'm sure they won't accept anyone who's friendly with Israel. So how can we move forward in a relationship? You're supposed to recognize each other and move forward. Israel recognizes the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian entity. It's not clear whether the Palestinians are prepared to recognize us. What I can say about the relationship is that it's a very warm relationship between Israel and the new normalized countries like UAE, Bahrain. And it's bringing about, ushering in a new era in the Middle East.
Well, I would happily ask not just another 20 or 25 minutes of questions, but another few hours of questions. But it seems to me that it's past time to ask Jessica to join us so we can address as many of our audience's questions as possible. Jessica, Welcome.
Thank you. Yes, we have so many questions coming in. I know we won't get through all of them, but I will do my best. In the early 1990s, when there was a back-channel negotiation between Israel and the PLO at that time was committed to the destruction of Israel and did not recognize its right to exist. The negotiations changed those positions. Why not try to negotiate with Hamas now?
Okay, as you said, as the questioner asked, they were back channels. They were not official because Israel does, you can't negotiate with an entity that doesn't recognize your existence. That's, as I said, what Bernard Lewis said, that you can negotiate on borders, but you can't negotiate whether you exist or you don't exist. What are you going to compromise? Half exist. So what happened was that the PLO at the time, until the back channels of Oslo, which began before Oslo, the PLO was negating the existence of the state of Israel. It was just like the Hamas in that aspect. What happened was that the elements in the PLO started hinting that they're prepared to change their policy. They're prepared to change their stand. And it started not direct talks with Israel. It started with European elements and others that brought about through track 2 talks, as we call them. They brought about the Oslo Accords. We get no such hint from the Hamas. The Hamas are bound to their charter. They're not prepared to change anything in their charter. They're sworn to the annihilation of the state of Israel and even to the killing of Jews. So there's no even signal from the Hamas. We would welcome any entity that is prepared to change its policy on Israel, accept Jews, and accept Israel as a legitimate entity. We have no such signal from Hamas. So while they stand in their position, there's no place for negotiation. Where we do have back channels that try and implement all kinds of ceasefire agreements, like we did now, and for instance, exchanges of prisoners of war or things like that. They hold, for instance, bodies of Israelis. They're not prepared even to negotiate through third parties in order for the humanitarian aspect of releasing for the families. So as it stands now, the Hamas has not signaled in any way that it's prepared to change its policy.
Jessica, if I can ask a quick follow-up of the Consul General. General Newman, Hamas and Hezbollah, for that matter, exist because of the support, if not sponsorship, of Iran. In order for the types of fundamental changes that you're talking about to occur with Hamas's relationship with Israel, it would require them to be told by the Iranian leadership that it was time to change course. Would Israel be any more likely to support a nuclear agreement between the US and other Western powers with Iran if Iranian support of terrorist activity were to be part of those negotiations?
Well, as you said, it's very true. Hamas and Hezbollah are supported by Iran financially and militarily. And that is one of the big problems here, because that's the elephant in the room. the Iran is actually the supporter, the #1 state supporter of terrorism in the world, dispelling unrest in the entire Middle East, trying to influence expand its Islamic revolution influence in the entire region of the Middle East. They've already been successful. They've expanded their influence from Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean Sea in Damascus. So, and they support Hamas and Hezbollah, and Hamas and Hezbollah are their proxy organizations. Whether Hamas can take an independent decision and decide, let's say, to recognize Israel, I doubt it. And that's going back to the question that I doubt that they have that ability, because their sponsor is Iran, and Iran. Would we be willing to, let's say, compromise on the JCPOA nuclear agreement for, let's say, recognition by the Hamas? Now, these are two issues, and I don't see any connection between them. The JCPOA we see as an existential threat to Israel. Nuclear capability is not something that we can live with. Military nuclear capability of Iran. We see it as an existential threat, and therefore we say we're not against diplomatic talks with Iran. We're against going back to the JCPOA as it was, because the JCPOA was paving the way for Iran to have legitimate nuclear military capability. It wasn't preventing, it was paving the way. It was giving legitimacy. And the second aspect was that the JCPOA didn't relate to all the malign activity of Iran, which is instilling unrest, sponsoring terrorism, etc. We are not against a diplomatic solution with Iran as long as it fixes the flaws of the JCPOA agreement. We cannot play a compromise agreement of, okay, we'll settle with nuclear capability for Hamas accepting Israel. That's not something we can live with. We'll welcome any change in the Hamas policy towards Israel and the Jews. We'll welcome any change in the Hezbollah, but we cannot compromise on the JCPOA for that.
Who was living in the homes in Sheikh Jarrah before the reunification of Jerusalem in 1967? And how far back is the court going in years/history to rule a home belongs to Israel versus a Palestinian, 1948 or further back?
The court ruling went back to the 19th century. It investigated the ownership of the homes from the 19th century and was proven beyond any doubt that the homes belonged to Jewish residents who were expelled, banished, don't know what you want to call it, by the Arab forces that took over in those periods. We've been through difficult times. We've been through the Ottoman Empire and the British mandate and the Egyptian and Jordan control. We've been through many, since the expelling of the Jews, we've been through many different sovereign forces. But they proved beyond any doubt that the houses belonged to Jews who had a full ownership of the homes already it can be proven from the 19th century. They were expelled. The homes were taken over by outside forces. The Jews came back, and there are Arab squatters who are in the homes who also refused to pay rent, and that's what triggered the entire court case.
How does Israel propose to deal with the heretofore unprecedented radicalization of Israeli Arabs?
Yes, that's an issue of grave concern. It's a very good question. One of the issues of the Hamas, as I said before, was to try and distill unrest between the Israeli Arabs and the Jews in Israel in order to try and prevent the integration of Israeli Arabs in Israeli society. There's a new party which came up in the elections, which is called the Ram party, which is an Arab party. Now, let me mention that in the previous Knesset, previous parliament of Israel, the third largest party was the Arab party. And that shows the strength of democracy in Israel and the civil rights of the Arab population. Those that have accepted Israeli citizenship and jurisdiction are full-fledged citizens of Israel. They have full rights and they vote for parliament just like any other citizen in the state of Israel. And they exercise their right, and the third largest party was the Arab party. But that Arab party focused very much on the political issues instead of taking care of the Israeli Arabs. So Ram, which Mansour Abbas is one of the Arab members of that party, broke away. He established a party and ran for election on an aspect of, I'm leaving the political issues and I'm going to take care of the Israeli Arabs. I'm going to go into a coalition even with Netanyahu and make a government so that I can take care of the well-being of the Israeli Arabs. He was actually pressing for integration of Israeli Arabs and leaving the political issues aside. He not only crossed the threshold, but he came in with 6 members of parliament, and there were already talk about the fact that if we went for election again, he would win more than the joint list of the large Arab party. So he has strong support in the Israeli Arabs. And the Hamas felt that they have to cut that. They have to block that integration. It's against their grain of, they want to isolate Israel, they want to cause disruption in Israel. It was against every of all of their being that Israeli Arabs should integrate in Israeli society. So part of the negative results of the violence is the fact that the Hamas incitement managed to bring about disunity between the Israeli Arabs and the Jews, which also burst out in violence in the what we call the mixed cities or the integrated cities like Akko, Jaffa, places like that. We hope that with time, it's not the first time that the Israeli Arabs were incited and acted out in violence. It happened in the past. From our experience, it takes a few days, weeks, and then they go back to the situation that we were in. Israel is doing its utmost in order to promote coexistence and integration of the Israeli Arabs in Israeli society.
Thank you. Is Hamas getting their weapons and missiles from Iran, and how are they being smuggled into Israel?
Yes, Iran has 2 main sources for its weapons. The first is from Iran. Iran is trying to send shipments. The shipments sometimes arrive at Damascus. Israel has said that it will do all that is necessary in order to prevent the infiltration of Iran, setting up of Iranian footholds in Syria. Sometimes you hear about these actions. Part of it is also these shipments, which go either to the Hezbollah or to the Hamas. Now, they smuggle it in either by boats, which they try to smuggle in by sea, or through tunnels from Egypt. They have, of course, a border with Egypt. And by the way, Egypt is of exactly the same opinion as Israel in the aspect of the Hamas. Israel doesn't allow, Egypt tries to block any smuggling from Egypt to Gaza Strip. And Egypt doesn't allow Palestinian workers to come and work in Egypt because they understand the threat. We do. We allow Palestinian workers. So this is part of the issue, that they smuggle it either through shipments or through tunnels, underground tunnels or other ways from Egypt. The second source that they have is self-production. And what they do is they bring in dual-use items, and they pretend that it's as if for construction and for building, for the good of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, but they actually bring it in order to build tunnels and build rockets, and then they set up factories for rockets. So all this aid that is given to them by the international community is abused. Instead of using it for building buildings, they then go forward and build tunnels and smuggle and build and start producing rockets in self-production lines. Those are the two main sources.
As a follow-up to, you mentioned Egypt. Can you talk about the Israel-Egyptian blockade of Gaza, its effects on the population there, and how and when it might be lifted, as was specified in the ceasefire after the last conflict in 2014?
Sure. Allow me to correct the person who asked the question. There is no blockade of Gaza. Any humanitarian aid or anything that people want to bring into Gaza can go to Gaza. The only thing is that we check, we monitor what goes in, because we don't want rockets. We don't want them to smuggle in rockets and smuggle in weapons and then attack Israeli civilians. And we have experience, bitter experience. So the only thing is that we request that we monitor and make sure what's on the boat or what's in the truck that is crossing. We facilitate the entrance of humanitarian aid on a daily basis. Hundreds, dozens, hundreds of trucks go through and boats. Our only request of Israel is that we know what's going in, that we don't allow things that can be rockets or worse. So that's not a blockade. That's just a security check of what goes in. And any entity that has a terrorist element that is ruling a piece of territory would want to know what's going in order to try and prevent the manufacturing of rockets. That's the only thing we do. That's not a blockade.
Is giving the aid to rebuild the Palestinian Authority likely to reach the people of Gaza?
That's a good question. Look, if it was Hamas, I would say 1% yes, 99% no. It will go to the war machine of the Hamas, because that's the reality. Within the Palestinian Authority, first of all, there are more checks and balances. The Palestinian Authority is more aware of the fact that, like, for instance, when Europeans give aid, then the Europeans do demand some kind of accountability. And the Palestinian Authority is more aware of this and more attentive to the fact that there must be accountability. Doesn't mean that all the factors in the Palestinian Authority don't abuse the money and use all kinds of manipulations in order to use the money for something against Israel. They do, but it's of a less less probability. It happens less. So I would say that yes, I have no doubt that parts of the aid that goes to the Palestinian Authority goes into some kind of resistance to Israel instead of building lives for the Palestinian people. But the statistics are much lower than what happens in the Gaza Strip.
Thank you. Dan or Consul General Newman, do you have polling information on the sentiments of Israelis and Palestinians about the current situation? Do you see any surprising differences between different generations?
Dan, do you want to answer that?
The polling information I've seen, which I've alluded to earlier, showed, somewhat to my surprise, the number of Israelis who are dissatisfied with the timing of the ceasefire. what I believe is the case, but I would defer to Hillel on this, is I believe, as is the case in this country, that younger Israelis might, to some degree, have been more in favor of that ceasefire. But I will defer to him on Israeli polling, and then he can defer to me on U.S. polling.
Okay. Look, of course, Israel, as I said, suffers every view. And you know, the joke about Israelis is that they have three points of view and they don't agree with any of them. So that's Israeli society. But polls, I think it's too early to look at polls. But what I can tell you from I do monitor what's going on. And yes, there have been difference of opinion about the timing of the ceasefire. There are some in Israeli society who believe that you need a strong deterrence in order to make sure that you don't have another wave of violence. What we call mowing the lawn. You have to, in order to clear the deck and have a few years of calm and quiet, you have to be very strong and have a very strong deterrence. And therefore, there was some in Israeli public that said we should not accept the ceasefire, and we should continue our demolishing of the terrorists and the terrorist infrastructure in Gaza, so that we'll have more time of calm and tranquility. So the equation is, the more you demolish the terrorist capabilities, the more time you'll have of peace and quiet. But everyone understands that peace and quiet is temporary. That's the problem here. I'll just say about Palestinian polls. You know, we don't have credible Palestinian polls. But I think that one thing that is interesting is that there have been a few clips of Israeli television going into the Palestinian Authority and asking the people what are their opinions. And it's all on camera. And before the outbreak of violence, they went into neighborhoods like Shechem, Ramallah, and other places which are Palestinian Authority. And they asked the people, what citizenship would you want? Would you want Israeli, Palestinian, Egyptian, or something else? And the vast majority said that they want Israeli citizenship over Palestinian citizenship. When you ask a Palestinian on the street what they want their own livelihood. They know that Israel can bring them that livelihood. And so there are many such polls which are informal polls. But I think we'll be surprised how many Palestinians disagree with the way their leadership is leading them.
This is a question that's come up a couple of times. What percentage of Israelis are fully vaccinated against COVID? Why doesn't Israel offer vaccinations to Palestinians?
Okay, the vast majority of the population of Israel are vaccinated. And we were #1 actually in the exit from coronavirus era. And with the domestic situation in Israel is that it's entirely open. We can do now events with tens of thousands of people. We have no internal restrictions. And the sickness has dropped to its lowest. So we're really in a very good situation. A lot of it is also due to the fact that we set up a multidisciplinary teams, which included, for instance, engineers, computer scientists, together with doctors, and they all worked on the solutions of different production lines of PPEs and different things that were needed, and of course the vaccinations. And also because Prime Minister Netanyahu was a tremendous nudnik. You know what a nudnik is? He annoyed the CEO of Pfizer and Moderna until they agreed to give the entire population vaccinations. In fact, one of the CEOs said on TV that Netanyahu used to call him at 3 in the morning to get vaccinations. And he said, I'll give you vaccinations. So that's part of the deal. Why Israel doesn't vaccinate? First of all, Israel does vaccinate the Palestinian people. We started off once we had enough for the citizens of Israel. I mean, our first obligation is towards the people of Israel. Just like Canada, its first obligation is to the Canadians. No one comes to Canada and asks, well, why aren't you vaccinating Portugal before you vaccinate your own citizens? That's absurd. So Israel first vaccinated its own citizens. And that includes the Israeli Arabs. The Israeli Arabs were among the Israeli population equally, they received entire vaccinations. Once we had vaccinated the majority of the state of Israel, we started vaccinating, first of all, the Palestinian workers that enter Israel. It is our interest that we bring down the sickness regionally as much as possible. So we have no opposition to vaccinating the Palestinians. In fact, we're in favor of it. It's just that everyone has their amounts of vaccinations and they have to do the accounting accordingly. But Israel, for instance, was in favor of bringing in Russian vaccinations, which had excess vaccinations from Russia. We brought it into the Palestinian Authority. We gave it to the Palestinian Authority. In fact, flights of aid arrived from UAE to give to the Palestinians, and the Palestinians refused to receive them. Can you imagine that? Palestinians refused to accept aid which arrived in UAE planes because they landed in Tel Aviv. So that's part of the situation.
Jessica, I know we're at 6 o'clock, but I can't resist. I'm going to ask Consul General Newman one last quick question before we go back to him. And this is going to be a prediction, Hillel. For those of us who do support a two-state solution, do you think at some point in the future there will be a Palestinian state?
I think that there will be a Palestinian independent entity. Whether you call it a state or you call it a state minus or autonomy plus, I'm not sure. But I think that in the end, there will be an independent Palestinian entity sitting side by side with Israel. That is the, I hope and believe will also come as soon as possible.
Okay. That gives me 10 more follow-up questions, which unfortunately I'm not able to ask. So I'll ask him to rejoin us and give you the proper thanks that you deserve for taking this time, not just to join us tonight, but for all you do to serve our community and help the relationship between our community and the people of Israel flourish to the degree that it has. So, Hillel Newman, it's wonderful to see you as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Consul General Newman. This was such an informative and important discussion. And Dan, thank you so much for moderating yet another program this week. It's a twofer. You're so important to us. So thank you both so very much.